On the morning of May 24, 1941, the British battlecruiser HMS Hood was the most famous warship on Earth. She was 860 feet long. She weighed 47,000 tons, fully loaded. She was called the Mighty Hood. She was the pride of the Royal Navy, and for 20 years she had sailed into every port in the world and made foreign governments nervous just by showing up. The men who served on her believed, without any doubt, that nothing in the ocean could kill her. They were wrong. It took 8 minutes. At 5:52 in the morning, in the freezing waters between Iceland and Greenland, the Hood opened fire on the German battleship Bismarck. The range was 25,000 yards, roughly 14 miles. The Hood's 15-inch guns roared. The shells fell near the Bismarck but missed. The Bismarck's guns answered. The German shells were falling short, then correcting. Then one of them did not miss. A single 15-inch armor-piercing shell from the Bismarck dropped at a steep angle and punched straight down through the Hood's upper deck. It went through the deck plating. It went through the compartments below. It reached the main ammunition magazine, where hundreds of shells for the ship's guns were stored. The explosion that followed was not an explosion. It was an event.
What have I done?
The Hood broke in half. The forward section and the aft section rose out of the water at sharp angles, like two hands praying, and then they sank. The entire process, from the shell impact to the ship disappearing beneath the surface, took 8 minutes. Of 1,415 men aboard, 3 survived. The rest went into the water and did not come out. The shockwave from that disaster rolled across the entire British war effort. Admiral John Tovey, commanding the British Home Fleet from his flagship HMS King George V, received the report and sat in silence for a long moment. He had 2 tasks now. First, he had to catch the Bismarck. Second, he had to kill her before she disappeared into the open Atlantic and started destroying British supply convoys. The Bismarck was not just a warship. She was a weapon designed for a specific mission, which was to starve Britain. The convoys crossing the Atlantic from America were the lifeline of the war. Food, fuel, weapons, ammunition, everything Britain needed to keep fighting arrived on those ships. A single battleship like the Bismarck, if she got loose in the Atlantic, could sink convoy after convoy. She was faster than most escorts, better armed than anything the British could put against her one-on-one, and her armor was so thick that standard naval shells simply bounced off her exterior at long range. Getting rid of the Hood had not been an accident. It had been a statement. Admiral Gunther Lütjens stood on the bridge of the Bismarck and watched the Hood sink. Lütjens was not a man who celebrated. He was thin, precise, and professionally cold. He did not cheer when the Hood went down. He checked his charts and thought about fuel. The Bismarck had taken some damage from the Hood. 2 hits, neither of them critical, but one of them was leaking oil, and one of the forward ammunition rooms had taken water. Nothing that could not be managed. Lütjens decided to break off and run for the port of Saint-Nazaire on the coast of occupied France. Once there, the damage could be repaired, the fuel replenished, and then the real mission could begin. He ordered his course set southwest and increased speed. The Bismarck began to pull ahead. Tovey watched his ships chase her and fall behind. The Bismarck was fast, 29 knots, nearly 35 miles per hour through the water. The British ships were struggling to match her speed in the rough North Atlantic seas. The destroyers could keep up, but their guns were too small. The battleships had the guns, but could not close the gap fast enough. Tovey did the math. At the current rate of chase, the Bismarck would reach the range of German air cover from France in approximately 40 hours. Once she got there, British warships could not follow without being bombed from above. The window to stop her was closing, and would close completely if something dramatic did not happen first. That is when someone in the command chain suggested the Swordfish. Admiral Tovey had on his books a carrier, HMS Ark Royal, which was steaming south at full speed, trying to get into a position where her aircraft could reach the Bismarck. The Ark Royal carried a complete squadron of Swordfish torpedo bombers. The reaction from some of the staff officers when this was proposed as a solution was not enthusiastic. Several of them said the word swordfish and then looked at the floor because they could not say what they were thinking with any politeness. The Swordfish was not a modern aircraft. It was not even a recent aircraft. It was a biplane, a throwback to the First World War, with two sets of fabric-covered wings stacked one above the other, an open cockpit where the crew sat exposed to the freezing air, and a fixed undercarriage, meaning the wheels did not retract when the plane was airborne. The Swordfish had gone into production in 1936, and at that point, it was already behind the technology curve. By 1941, every modern air force in the world was flying fast, powerful monoplanes. The Swordfish flew at 138 miles per hour at maximum speed, with no load. With a torpedo slung underneath it, the speed dropped closer to 100 miles per hour. A fast car on a motorway went nearly that quickly. The Japanese Zero fighter could fly at 330 miles per hour. The German Messerschmitt 109 could go 350. If a Zero or a 109 found a Swordfish, the outcome was not a dogfight. It was an execution. The pilots who flew them knew all of this. They were not stupid men. They understood the performance charts. Many of them had looked at the specifications for the aircraft they were assigned, and then looked at the specifications for the aircraft they were likely to fight against, and had quietly gone back to their quarters and thought hard thoughts. The Swordfish was slow. It was fragile in some ways and strangely durable in others. The fabric on the wings was not metal. High-speed cannon shells from a modern fighter sometimes passed straight through the fabric without detonating properly, because there was not enough resistance to trigger the fuse. Sometimes this helped. Often it did not matter, because the pilot or the engine took the hit instead. Lieutenant Commander Eugene Esmond commanded the Swordfish Squadron aboard HMS Ark Royal. He was 32 years old, and he had been flying for the Royal Navy for more than a decade. He was Irish. He was quiet. He was the kind of officer who said very little, but who, when he did speak, said exactly what needed to be said. He had already taken his aircraft into combat earlier in the pursuit of the Bismarck, and on that first run, something had gone catastrophically wrong. His squadron had located a ship in the fog and launched their torpedoes. The ship was HMS Sheffield, a British cruiser that was also trying to track the Bismarck. Fortunately, the torpedoes had missed or had detonated prematurely in the rough water due to faulty magnetic pistols. The Sheffield had survived. Esmond's squadron had returned to the Ark Royal in complete silence, and the men had sat in the briefing room and not spoken to each other for a long time. They had nearly killed their own people with the weapons that were supposed to win this battle. Now, a few hours later, the same men were told they were going up again. The conditions had not improved. If anything, they were worse. The weather over the North Atlantic on the afternoon and evening of May 26, 1941, was not a test pilot would choose to fly in. Wind gusts were hitting 50 miles per hour. The carrier was pitching in seas where the deck rose and fell 45 feet between the crest of one wave and the trough of the next. The cloud ceiling was down to about 700 feet. The spray off the wave tops was being flung horizontally across the flight deck. The temperature was just above freezing. Esmond stood in his flying kit, the wind hitting him like a hammer, and looked at his aircraft. The Swordfish sat on the deck, slowly rising and falling with the ship, wings spread, torpedo attached, looking exactly like what it was, a fabric-covered biplane from another era surrounded by the machinery of a modern war. It was not designed to fight. He put his foot on the step, swung himself into the cockpit, pulled on his helmet, and waited for the signal to launch. The men who designed the mission had a problem that went beyond weather. They had fuses, the magnetic pistols that had failed earlier, The ones that had caused the torpedoes to detonate on contact with the waves instead of against the hull of the target, had been replaced. The new fuses were contact fuses. They would only detonate when they physically hit something solid. The change was made in the hangar below decks in a matter of hours by men working with frozen fingers in poor light, with the deck moving under them the entire time. Nobody complained. There was no time. The briefing before launch was short. Esmond gathered his crews and told them what they already knew. The Bismarck was running for France. She had roughly 24 hours of open water before German air cover could reach her. If she made it, she would be repaired, refueled, and sent out again, and next time she would not be chasing one convoy. She would be the anchor of an entire German naval task force designed to cut Britain's Atlantic lifeline completely. Esmond did not tell his men they were going to stop the greatest battleship ever built with a biplane from 1936. He just told them the target's last known position, the attack heading, and the recognition signal for the Sheffield, which they absolutely had to avoid hitting again. Then he walked back to his aircraft, climbed in, and signaled he was ready. The deck handlers pulled the chocks from the wheels. The ship turned into the wind. The Swordfish rolled forward. The gap between the bow of the carrier and the open ocean came up fast. The pilot pulled back on the stick. The biplane climbed into the howling sky, heavy with the torpedo hanging underneath it, slow, ugly, and completely alone in the gray air above one of the most dangerous oceans on Earth. Behind Esmond, 14 more Swordfish launched one by one. They climbed out of the spray and formed up. 15 biplanes, cruising at somewhere between 90 and 100 miles per hour in winds that made the turbulence rough enough to throw a man against the side of the cockpit, heading toward a battleship that had 8 radar-directed 15-inch guns in 4 turrets, 12 6-inch guns in 6 more turrets, 16 105mm anti-aircraft guns, and numerous lighter weapons. The Bismarck could fire in every direction. Her anti-aircraft armament was dense enough to fill a corridor of sky with shrapnel, through which no modern aircraft at high speed could comfortably fly. The Swordfish flew at low speed. At their approach speed, they were going to be visible to the German gunners for a long time before they were close enough to release a torpedo. Nobody on the carrier who watched them go pretended this was a comfortable situation. The operations staff returned to their work. Esmond's observer, looking backward from the rear cockpit as they headed for the Bismarck, could see nothing behind them now, just low clouds and the dark rolling Atlantic. The carrier had already disappeared into the weather. Aboard the Bismarck, the mood was not triumph. It had not been triumph for several hours. Gunther Lutyens had won the battle against the Hood the previous morning and then almost immediately started worrying about fuel. The hit from the Hood had opened a small leak in one of the bow fuel tanks, and oil was trailing behind the ship in a thin slick that British search aircraft could follow. He had radioed to his superiors in Germany a request for a tanker rendezvous. The request had been acknowledged. None of the answers he received seemed to fully understand the urgency of his position. He was the fastest and most powerful surface warship in the Atlantic, and he was running from the British fleet. He did not find this satisfying. The Bismarck's crew numbered over 2,000 men. They had been at sea under combat readiness conditions for days. They were tired. The ventilation inside the armored hull was not designed for the kind of sustained high-speed running they were doing, and the interior of the ship smelled of diesel and sweat and stress. The younger sailors who had never been in combat before the engagement with the Hood were quieter now than they had been when the ship left port 3 days earlier. They had seen the Hood die in 8 minutes, and some of them were thinking privately that if the Hood could go that way, so could the Bismarck. They kept that thought to themselves because expressing it would have been useful to nobody. But it was there. At around 1600 hours on May 26th, the ship's radar operators picked up aircraft contacts. Lutyens noted the report. Aircraft from a British carrier. He had expected this. The British had carriers in the area, and he knew they would eventually put up an attack. He ordered his anti-aircraft crews to their stations and increased his zigzag maneuver. The Bismarck began to weave, changing course in unpredictable patterns to complicate the targeting problem for any torpedo aircraft. This was standard doctrine. Against fast aircraft dropping fast torpedoes, a zigzag could work. Against slow aircraft dropping slow torpedoes in the North Atlantic in a 40-knot wind, the calculation was about to become much more complicated. Esmond's 15 Swordfish had found the Bismarck. The initial approach through the clouds had been confusing. Visibility was down to almost nothing in places, and the aircraft had to navigate partly on instruments and partly by instinct, dropping below the cloud base periodically to get a visual fix on the sea surface and make sure they knew which direction was down. When they broke through the base of the overcast and saw the Bismarck below them, she was closer than expected and already maneuvering. 19,000 tons of battleship, moving at 28 knots, leaves a distinctive wake. Even in the gray, choppy sea, the white foam boiling from her propellers was visible from several miles. Esmond saw it. He began his division into attack groups. This was where training took over from courage, because courage alone would not get a torpedo into the right place on the Bismarck. A torpedo has to enter the water at a specific angle, at a specific depth, and on a specific heading relative to the target, or it does not work. Drop it too steep, and it dives into the bottom. Drop it too shallow, and it skips and tumbles. Approach from the bow or the stern, and the target presents the thinnest possible profile. The torpedo needs to hit the side of the ship to tear through the hull plating below the waterline, and to do that, the aircraft needs to be flying roughly perpendicular to the target's course when it releases the weapon. This means the pilot needs to calculate the target's speed and heading, fly out to the side, turn in, maintain the correct approach angle, drop at the correct range, and then get out of the way of the anti-aircraft fire and the ship itself. All of this at 100 miles per hour, in 50-mile-per-hour winds, in low clouds, above a freezing sea, while the ship is trying to shoot you out of the sky. When Esmond's first wave came in, the Bismarck's anti-aircraft guns opened up. The sound on the Bismarck's bridge was enormous, 16 105mm guns firing simultaneously, created a noise and a percussion that sailors described afterward as being inside a drum, while someone beat the outside with a hammer. The 37mm guns added their faster, higher-pitched fire. The 20mm close defense weapons began to track the incoming biplanes. The German gunners were experienced and well-trained. They could see the Swordfish clearly against the sky. The aircraft were slow enough that leading them was not technically difficult. The problem, which the gunners would not fully articulate until later when they compared notes on what had happened, was that the aircraft flew too slowly. German anti-aircraft fire control solutions were calculated for aircraft moving at 200 or 300 kilometers per hour. At those speeds, the shell, the aircraft, and the point in space where they would meet could be predicted. At 100 kilometers per hour, the aircraft was slow enough that the standard solutions required recalculation that the fire control systems were not optimized for. The German guns were also producing their own interference. The 105mm charges produced large black smoke bursts that obscured the view of the smaller guns. The ship was turning, which changed the angles relative to the incoming aircraft every few seconds. And the sea conditions were rough enough that the ship was rolling as she turned, which threw off the gyroscopic stabilization that kept the gun directors level. None of this meant the Swordfish were safe. They were not safe. Esmond's lead aircraft took hits during the attack. Splinters from near-miss detonations punched through the fabric wings. One of the aircraft had a strut damaged by cannon fire, and the pilot had to fight the controls to keep it on a straight approach line. Several crews reported afterward that they could smell the propellant from the German guns, which gives a reasonable impression of how close some of the shells were detonating. The sky around the incoming aircraft was filled with black bursts and falling shrapnel. That any of them kept coming is its own statement. They kept coming because they had to. If they turned away, the torpedo mission failed. If the torpedo mission failed, the Bismarck reached France. If the Bismarck reached France and was repaired, the Atlantic convoys would be next. The men in those swordfish had been briefed on what the Bismarck represented as a strategic weapon. They understood the chain of consequence. They pressed the attack. Most of the torpedoes missed. That is the honest account. Of 15 aircraft making the attack, most of the weapons they dropped were avoided by the Bismarck's course changes or had faulty runs. The Bismarck was maneuvering hard. Lutyens was an experienced fleet commander, and he knew how to work a ship against torpedo bombers. He turned into one group, forcing them to change their approach, then swung away from another group, presenting a narrowing profile. The wake of the ship was covered in churning foam from the constant hard rudder applications. 2 torpedoes hit. The first one struck amidships, on the armor belt, exactly where the Bismarck was strongest. The hit shook the ship violently enough that men were thrown off their feet in compartments 3 decks below the waterline. The armor absorbed most of the blast. Damage control teams reported flooding in 2 compartments, but the inflow could be handled. Lutyens received the damage report and continued maneuvering. The ship was still capable of 27 knots. She was still heading for France. The second torpedo changed everything. It struck the stern. Specifically, it struck the area of the steering compartment and the starboard rudder. The explosion cracked the compartment wall and jammed both rudders. They locked, not amidships where they would have allowed straight-line sailing, but at a 12-degree angle to port. The Bismarck had been in a hard starboard turn when the torpedo hit. The rudders locked in that position. The ship immediately began curving to port in a large circle. The helmsman fought the wheel. The wheel spun free. There was nothing connected at the other end. The rudder linkages were gone. The Bismarck, which had for the past 24 hours been racing at nearly 30 knots through the North Atlantic, was now incapable of sailing in a straight line. She could only go in a large, slow circle. The greatest battleship on Earth was going nowhere. Below decks, damage control parties and diving equipment tried to reach the steering compartment through the flooded passages. The water was so cold that working in it, even in protective gear, was almost impossible. The sea state was too rough to attempt external work on the rudder from boats alongside. Engineers examined the possibility of rigging emergency steering using the propeller shafts, running one engine faster than the other to compensate for the locked rudder. They tried it. The ship straightened slightly. Then the wind and sea conditions undid the correction. The ship began to circle again. Lutyens sent a message to the German Naval High Command. The message was brief, and it said that the ship could not be steered. He added that the crew was prepared to fight to the last shell. On the bridge, Lutyens looked at his chart. The coast of France was roughly 400 miles to the southeast. 400 miles might as well have been 4,000, with no working rudder, and the British fleet closing from multiple directions. He knew what was coming. He had known since the torpedo hit registered on the hull that his calculation of the next 24 hours had fundamentally changed. He had expected to be in port in France by evening of the following day. He was now going to be standing on this bridge when the British battleships found him. The question was no longer whether the Bismarck would be taken under fire. The question was how long she would last. He wrote a final signal to the Naval High Command. He described his position, his damage, and the situation he expected to face within hours. He ended it with a sentence that translated, roughly, as the ship will fight until the last shell has been fired. Then he looked out at the gray Atlantic and waited. Meanwhile, on the Ark Royal, Esmond's aircraft were landing back on the pitching deck one by one. The landings were dangerous on a normal day. With the deck rising and falling 45 feet in the North Atlantic swell, each landing was a controlled collision with a moving surface. Several aircraft were damaged beyond repair in the landing sequence, not by enemy fire, but by the sea conditions. The pilots climbed down from the cockpits and were told by the flight deck handlers that the mission had resulted in 2 hits. Some of them did not believe it initially. They had watched the ship maneuvering violently during their attacks and had expected everything to have missed. When they were told 1 hit had jammed the rudder, the briefing room went quiet in a particular way that was not sadness and not quite joy, but something in between. The job was not finished. The Bismarck was still afloat, but she was stopped. The night of May 26th into May 27th, 1941, was not quiet in the North Atlantic. British destroyers found the Bismarck in the dark and harassed her. HMS Cossack, HMS Maori, HMS Zulu, and HMS Sikh made repeated torpedo runs through the rough water, driving in through the darkness at high speed, launching their weapons, and pulling away. The Bismarck fired back with everything she had. Most of the torpedoes from the destroyers missed in the poor visibility. The sea conditions were making accurate attacks almost impossible, but the harassment was achieving something. The Bismarck's crew could not rest. The damage control parties trying to fix the rudder were being shaken by near-miss explosions every time a destroyer came close. Men were exhausted and could not sleep because the ship's guns were firing, and the explosions from near misses were working through the hull. Lutjens spent the night on the bridge. Several of his senior officers urged him to allow crew rotations so that at least some men could get a few hours of rest. He agreed, but limited the rest periods to the men not directly involved in defense or damage control. He himself did not leave the bridge. He was 62 years old and had been on his feet through the engagement with the Hood the previous morning, through the evasion maneuvers during the Swordfish attack the previous afternoon, and now through the running fight with the destroyers in the night. He did not look well. His staff officers did not comment on this. The Bismarck was still circling, or more precisely, she was making a series of large arcing turns as the crew tried to manage her course through engine control alone. Running the port shafts faster than the starboard shafts could crab the bow slightly to the right. Running the starboard shafts faster brought her left. By constantly adjusting the balance of thrust, the engineers could keep her moving in roughly one direction, but it was exhausting work, and any interruption to the engineering spaces, such as a torpedo hit or a large bomb hit nearby, would end it. The ship was moving at roughly 8 knots, a crawl. She was heading roughly north or northeast, back toward the British fleet, because the locked rudder and the prevailing sea conditions made trying to head southeast toward France essentially impossible. She was drifting toward the enemy because that was the only direction the physics of her situation allowed. At dawn on May 27th, the situation from the British side was clear, and from the German side was also clear, just in a different way. Admiral Tovey had his main fleet in position. He had HMS King George V and HMS Rodney in company. The Rodney was an older ship, but she carried 9 16-inch guns in 3 turrets, and she was a battleship, which was exactly what the situation required. Tovey also had cruisers. HMS Norfolk and HMS Dorsetshire were in the area. He had enough firepower to handle what remained of the situation. The question in the final hours of the night had not been whether the Bismarck would be caught, but whether the British ships had enough fuel to maintain the chase long enough to bring the fleet to action before they had to turn back for port. King George V was running low. Rodney had enough. Tovey decided to continue. At 8:47 in the morning of May 27th, HMS Rodney opened fire on the Bismarck at a range of approximately 24,000 yards. The Bismarck fired back. The Bismarck's first salvos at dawn were accurate, close, and frightened the bridge crews of both British battleships. The German fire control was still functional. The rangefinders were still working. The turret crews were still capable. Waterspouts from near-miss shells rose next to the Rodney in the first minutes of the engagement. and the Rodney's crew felt the shock of the water columns falling against the hull. For a brief moment, there was a possibility, a small one, that the Bismarck might inflict serious damage before she was overwhelmed. Then the British shells started hitting. The difference between 16-inch shells hitting a ship and smaller shells hitting a ship is not just a matter of degree, it is a matter of geometry. A 16-inch armor-piercing shell at full striking velocity goes through armor that nothing installed on a normal warship can stop it. Even the Bismarck's famously heavy belt armor, which had been designed specifically to resist high-caliber fire, could not hold at the ranges and angles of the morning's engagement. The first hit from Rodney took out one of the Bismarck's forward turrets. The turret was destroyed. The men inside it were gone. The second hit from King George V struck the superstructure and destroyed the main fire control director. After the fire control director was gone, the main guns could still fire, but the crews had lost the central system that calculated range and deflection automatically. They had to switch to local control. Local control, at 24,000 yards, with the ship making unpredictable small course changes and the gun platform itself vibrating from hits, was not precision shooting. The German salvos began falling farther from the British ships. The Bismarck's secondary armament continued to fire. Her 6-inch gun crews kept firing. Men kept feeding ammunition up from the magazines, kept closing breaches, kept pulling firing lanyards, because that was their job, and they had not been told to stop, and Lutyens did not stop the engagement. The broadside was ragged compared to what it had been at 8:47, but it was still happening. The Bismarck was absorbing hits that would have stopped most ships and still fighting, which was what she had been built to do. The armor absorbed. The flooding was contained in some compartments. The crew was disciplined and experienced, and they kept functioning inside a ship that was being destroyed around them. But the arithmetic of the morning was not in the Bismarck's favor. The British had more ships, the enemy was not maneuvering, and every hit was cumulative. The forward turrets went silent. Then the after turrets began to slow. A hit in the stern area reached one of the engine spaces. A second hit destroyed another fire control position. By 9:30, the Bismarck's main armament had been silenced. Every turret that had 6 hours earlier been capable of sending a 2,000-pound shell 14 miles was now either destroyed, flooded, or blocked. The hull was flooding in multiple compartments. The crew was fighting fires in the superstructure and in compartments that could not be reached through the flooding. Survivors described the interior of the ship at that point as a series of isolated pockets of men working by flashlight or by the light of fires, in compartments cut off from the rest of the ship by water, or by collapsed bulkheads, or by fire, continuing to do their jobs until they could not. Lutyens was no longer on the bridge. Exactly when that happened is not fully clear, because there were very few witnesses on the bridge who survived to give a full account. At some point in the late morning, a shell had struck the bridge, and the command structure of the ship had effectively ended. Below, in the machinery spaces, in the magazine handling rooms, in the medical bay where the ship's doctors were working in conditions that made effective treatment nearly impossible, men continued to function. HMS Dorsetshire had been ordered in to finish the ship with torpedoes. The Bismarck was still afloat and still technically dangerous because of her remaining secondary weapons. Dorsetshire made her runs, launching torpedoes into the Bismarck at close range. Several hit. The Bismarck listed. She began to roll. At 10:36 in the morning on May 27, 1941, the Bismarck capsized and sank. She had been engaged for 1 hour and 49 minutes. The water at that position in the North Atlantic is approximately 15,700 feet deep. She hit the bottom at a speed that broke her into sections. Of the Bismarck's crew of over 2,000 men, 114 survived. The British ships that came to pick up survivors broke off the rescue operation when a German submarine was reported in the area. Many men who were still alive in the water when the British ships turned away did not survive the ocean. The account that spread through the British Navy in the days following was complicated in the way that accounts of violent events always are. The Bismarck had killed over 1,400 men on the Hood in 8 minutes. She had been chased for 3 days and had nearly escaped into the Atlantic, where she would have been a weapon against the entire supply chain of the war. What stopped her from escaping was not the British battleships. The battleships came later. What stopped her from running was a second-order event, almost an accident of war. A fabric-covered biplane from a pre-war era dropping a torpedo in rough weather onto an impossible target and getting lucky with the angle. The torpedo that jammed the rudder was not technically a precision weapon. It was not guided. It was a simple metal cylinder full of explosive driven by a propeller, dropped from an aircraft designed in 1936 and built like a product of 1918, flown through a wall of anti-aircraft fire by a pilot who had no armor, no ejection seat, and no speed advantage over almost anything in the air. The fact that it hit at all required the approach to go correctly, the drop angle to be correct, and the detonation to happen at the right moment relative to the hull. Any number of small variations would have caused it to miss or to fail to detonate. It hit. It detonated. The rudder jammed. The fastest and most powerful warship in the Atlantic stopped running. Eugene Esmond landed his Swordfish on the Ark Royal, climbed down, and went below to file his report. He did not know for hours what the full result of his squadron's attack had been. He was informed later, in the cautious language of official naval communications, that the attack had been decisive. He accepted this information and went back to what he was doing, which was preparing his aircraft for whatever came next. The war had not ended. It never ended after one battle. There would be another mission, another briefing, another aircraft to fly in conditions that should have prevented flying. Esmond was killed 9 months later in February 1942, leading another Swordfish attack in similarly impossible circumstances against German warships passing through the English Channel in broad daylight. He was awarded the Victoria Cross posthumously, the highest military decoration the British government gives, awarded to him after his death for gallantry that any honest observer would have to describe as something beyond what most men are capable of performing. But on the night of May 26, 1941, sitting in his quarters aboard HMS Ark Royal after the debriefing, he was 32 years old and the pilot of a biplane that the experts had written off before the war started. His aircraft had been built in 1936 out of canvas and wire, and it flew slower than the highway speed limit of several European countries. It was supposed to be obsolete. It was supposed to be everything a modern naval aircraft should not be. It had helped stop the greatest battleship the German Navy had ever built, not by any genius of its design, but because it got low enough and slow enough and close enough in conditions that no other aircraft would have attempted, and because the man flying it kept going when every rational voice in the world would have told him to turn back. That is why they still talk about the Swordfish, not because it was a good aircraft by the standards of 1941. It was not. But because what it did on the afternoon of May 26, 1941, in 40-knot winds and 700-foot ceilings above a freezing ocean, against a target with those guns and those fire control systems, remains one of the most improbable outcomes in the history of naval warfare. A museum piece stopped the most modern warship on Earth. The ancient plane won. The fastest ship lost. And history, which usually rewards the strong and the modern and the well-armed, had to make a note in the margin about a fabric biplane and what it managed to do when nobody thought it could.